Hello and welcome back everyone, we Weeb Online, and today I'm gonna continue the story What If Naruto Mastered How to Edit Seals Part 14. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
He had to give it to her, because when he told her the same day that he needed to wear something nice to a dinner with the head of the Hyuga clan, Mai did a great job with his outfit. His loose black clothes were simple but fine, almost to the point of being exquisite. They showed off his pale skin, which brought out the color of his hair and eyes even more. If he was being honest, though, he much preferred the furs he had worn last month when he met with the Yamanaka. Even though they weren't all that impressive, they were very comfortable. That's not to say that these weren't comfortable, because the soft fabric was cool to the touch and fit loosely enough to feel like a ghost against his skin. However, the heavy warmth and simplicity of the furs gave him a comfort that was hard to match. Still, he thought he could get used to this clothing, since he didn't have many other options. Even if he didn't say anything about becoming a daimyo, Mai would make sure he wore the right clothes for his new position. She probably wouldn't take no for an answer, either. It was probably for the best, since he was much more likely to go about his business as if he were still a young student at the academy who had somehow gotten an army. Image was important, but Naruto had never really cared about how he looked. Instead, he focused on how he made people feel. He wasn't trying to fit in. Instead, he was trying to say something. Most of the time, he also showed that message through what he did, so what he wore wasn't that important. Unfortunately, this game still had rules, and he couldn't break all of them if he wanted to keep playing. And, of all the rules, he didn't mind having to dress the part too much. Also, there was something to say about getting dressed up. The clothes someone wears can make or break their image, but they can also change how they feel. The furs were wild at heart, but they had a natural power to them. But wearing these black robes made him feel like the daimyo he had become. He had always been a lord because of his refined power and cold calm, but now he could really think of himself as one. Still, it was too bad that he probably wouldn't wear his furs again. Even if what he was wearing now was more appropriate, Mai had told him that she thought he looked better in these black clothes. If she had her way, he would keep wearing them. In case you were not sure, she did. After smoothing his sleeves and making sure he had both daggers, he moved his hands down to the purple sash that went between his black shirt and pants. He was careful not to catch his fingers on the fine gold embroidery. He wasn't sure if it wasn't real gold, but if it was, it wouldn't surprise him. He checked quietly to make sure the 4 daggers were still there. He didn't stop to look for the 7th dagger because he couldn't do that while he was walking. However, he could feel it against the outside of his right calf, where it was held by the white bandages that held his pants to his woven sandals. As far as he knew, his shoes were the most basic thing he was wearing, since nothing seemed to set them apart from any other pair. Mai wanted to dress him in the best clothes, but she was also very practical, so he wouldn't be surprised if she skipped the fancy stuff so he could have a good pair of sandals in case something went wrong. He really hoped nothing would happen, but it never hurts to be ready to leave if the gods get bored. Gods, of course, made him think of how the Hyuga believed in fate, which almost made him groan. If Hiashi was like most Hyuga, fate would come up a lot during the dinner, especially if he stayed for a while, which was likely given the Hyuga's status, since the dinner could easily last several hours and could very well take at least 8, and that would get old very quickly. Even if this diner was a royal pain in the behind, at least Hinata would be there. If everything goes well, he should be able to use her to steer the conversation back on track if Hiashi starts talking about fate. At least, that's what he hoped. She tried hard not to stare, or at least that's what she told herself. But this was the boy who had stood up for her sister. By the gods, the former heiress had every reason to be in love. Inside and outside of her clan, many of the men were seen as attractive in a way that was almost feminine, but she had never been tempted to call a man beautiful before. But there was no other way to describe the young man in front of her. And to think, he was the one who had put her sister under his protection, and now he was the one she needed protection from. He was a young man with ties to the dangerous wolves, who had just been made a noble house by the daimyo. She was sure that Naruto would fit right in with the Imperial Fire Court. The thought was enough to make her cheeks turn just a little bit red. The change was too small to be seen in the orange light of the formal dining room of the compound, but it was enough to make her cheeks feel warm. She found it hard to take her eyes off of him, though, and her sister and maybe even her father would agree. The light around him was absorbed by the midnight cloth, which was loose enough to not be constricting but close-fitting enough to be form-fitting. His pale skin, on the other hand, reflected the light of the room, which made her doubt for a second that he was just a young man. A beautiful young man, but still just a young man. His skin did not reflect light, but his hair did. Instead, it seemed to capture it, burning orange and flaming as the candles flickered. It looked like the son of Amaterasu was wearing a crown of living flames on his head. Then again, he seemed so beautiful to her that maybe this was Amaterasu herself visiting the mortal world. Her body shook a little at the thought. If it was really Amaterasu sitting at their table and her sister Hinata knew about it and talked to her, then maybe Hinata was a goddess or at least had some kind of connection to fate that they didn't understand. She shook her head to get rid of the idea that was trying to take hold. That was a stupid way of thinking. Neither her sister nor the boy sitting across from her father was a god. Even as she tried to dismiss the idea, his purple eyes shone with more light than could have come from the open flames, and her small body shook again. She knew for sure that her sister wasn't a god, but Naruto. Naruto could be related to the gods, and that gave her even more reason to get on his good side. She looked at her sister with a soft smile on her face. Even though the light made her blush less obvious, it didn't change the way she looked at their guest. Not that she could really blame her. He had a straight back, looked like a king, and had a very commanding presence. He didn't look comfortable in his new black clothes with just a touch of purple and a hint of gold, but he also didn't look like he was in any pain. It was as if he had always been meant to wear them, because they were perfect for the new status he had just gained. Hyuga Hinata didn't believe in fate as much as the rest of her family did, but she couldn't deny that something more was going on in the life of the young man sitting so elegantly at their table, as if it were perfectly natural for him to be eating with the head of the Hyuga. Her eyes looked at him for a moment, and she felt her cheeks getting hot. His good looks were undeniable, as shown by the fact that her younger sister couldn't help but stare at him the whole time they were eating. However, she was learning that there was a big difference between when he was just going about his business and when he was taking care of it. The room was filled with his confidence and power, which made everyone look at him and give him their full attention. During the dinner conversation, even her father had to make an effort to look at his daughters so it didn't look like he was staring at his honored guest. Even though everyone was looking at him, Naruto didn't seem to notice at all, which Hinata knew right away wasn't true. Still, he just sat there with the tiniest smile on his face as he politely answered what her father said. If she didn't know the leader of the wolves as well as she did, she might have thought he was just a shy, quiet person who didn't want to stand out. Even when he just nodded along with what her father was saying, his strong presence should have been enough to show those who didn't know better how wrong they were. No, he was just quiet because it wasn't time for him to do anything yet. At the same time that her father was trying to figure out what his guest was like, the guest was doing the same thing to her father. He was looking at everything about him to figure out how he could make the most of his current situation. He was definitely a wolf, and he was usually on the hunt. But right now, she thought of him as a snake waiting to strike, its forked tongue hidden until it was time to trick its prey into thinking it was safe. She had to say it was strange that he always looked like a different animal. Was it because he didn't look exactly like any one animal, or did he change whenever it would help him reach his goals? Hinata thought it was probably both, which wasn't a big surprise. When she turned away from the young man, whose role in her life she wasn't sure of, her lavender eyes fell on her sister, who was still trying to look like she wasn't too interested in her guest. At the very least, it told Hinata why her sister had brought up the fact that she had never thanked Naruto for what he had done to protect the honor of the clan, or whatever nonsense her father had agreed to. She swore that Hanabi either really believed in the stupid teachings of the elders or was just too good at using them to get what she wanted from their father, and it almost made her smile wider. To make sure it didn't happen, she had to think for a moment about why her sister wanted to meet Naruto. His connection to the wolves, or powerful allies, as her father called them, had been known for over a year without her saying anything, and it wasn't until Hanabi brought up the idea of meeting with him that the House of Wolves was revealed to be part of the Imperial Fire Court, so that couldn't have been it. So, what had she been doing? Could it not be related to the wolves at all? Was she just interested in him because she had heard her talk about him or seen him around the village? Did it involve her in some way? Was that why her sister became interested all of a sudden? But that made no sense, because she hadn't really been doing anything. In fact, she hadn't done much besides meet with some of the more powerful people in her flock of Narutos, she corrected herself, and that was about it. That's when she had the idea. If she was just taking care of the flock, and Hanabi's desire to meet Naruto was because of what she did Hanabi know about the flock? The young man had told Hanabi that she was under his protection back at the academy, so Hanabi might have known about the flock. If so, what did she have in mind? Dinner went on pretty much the same way for the next 2 hours. Naruto didn't care that Hinata was getting nervous, and he was only slightly interested in how her sister's eyes were a mix of doubt and hope as she kept looking at him. He didn't care about either of those things. On the other hand, Hiyashi was driving him crazy. Without a doubt, everyone felt the same way. He had been able to figure out what people were like around him for a long time, and if he said so himself, he was pretty good at the games that were often played in the hard dance of politics. The same seemed to be true for Hiyashi, which was a shame. If not for the almost unnoticeable look on his face that matched how he felt about the situation, he might have thought he was in over his head. This was better because it was fair, but it didn't make it any less hard to deal with. Things were going well, except that they were moving slowly because they were both trying to figure out what the other was doing without showing their hands. This would have been easier if the clan head had been more likely to underestimate him. Music from a room next door filled the air, and it was easy to hear even through the thin walls. The food was good. Even though it was a formal setting, someone who had already eaten at the daimyo's palace would have found it warm and comfortable. Even though the game he was playing with his host was getting boring, he was still having a good time. Still, he couldn't help but be grateful to the youngest daughter, the one who didn't seem to be able to decide if his being there was a good thing or not, when she spoke up for what had to be less than a dozenth time that evening. "Father, it's been a while since we ate," she said. "Maybe we should take a short break so I can show our guest around the gardens." Before he nodded, the thoughtful frown was only on his face for a moment. "That's a good idea," the clan head agreed. He turned to his oldest daughter and said, "I think we could all use a moment to stretch our legs and let our food settle. Tell the kitchens that we're done eating, and they'll have something sweet ready for us when we come back." At least to Naruto, it was clear that he wanted some time to himself so he could think about the meeting so far without having to talk. Naruto could see why the man did what he did, and he had to give the man a mental tip of the hat. He wouldn't have the same advantage because he would be going through the gardens with the heiress. Knowing this, he couldn't help but look the man in the eyes, smirk, and tilt his head just a little bit to show that he knew what was going on. He knew, and he was okay with it. Hiyashi made a similar, but much smaller, smirk, and for a moment it looked like the man didn't know if he was more upset about being seen through so easily or amused that the boy did seem to be his match. It was definitely strange to both of them. Not often enough, they were put to the test. Even though he didn't want to, Naruto liked the head of the Hyuga clan, even though he knew what was going on behind the man's back. If he got in the way, it would be a shame. The sun had set by the time they were done eating, and now there was only a chill of warmth in the air. Soon, though, it would be gone as night took over the whole world. There weren't many lit lanterns around the compound, probably because the guards didn't need it to be too bright to see intruders. However, the full moon was more than enough to light up the darkness. As they walked along the path of the main Hyuga gardens, they didn't hear much except for the faint rustle of nearby leaves as a light breeze caressed them and the occasional swish of their clothes. He thought there would be at least one person around, but maybe they just went to bed earlier than most people in the village. Either that, or someone had set up privacy. He didn't know if it was Hiyashi or Hanabiya. He glanced briefly at the young woman walking next to him, or if it was just a coincidence, or if other clan members had seen them and given them space on their own. He also didn't know if it mattered. "En Naruto-san." She broke the comfortable silence between them by saying, "En Naruto-san." He looked back at her. She had spoken, but she didn't dare look into his eyes. It was almost like she was scared, but she didn't seem scared. Instead, she seemed hesitant and worried. "Yes, Hanabi-san." He gave her a soft smile to reassure her more than because he liked being with her, which he did, but that wasn't the point. The young daimyo didn't know if she could see it or not. She pointed to a bench and asked, "Can we sit down for a minute? I'd like to talk to you." He raised his eyebrow and frowned. He didn't know what she might want to talk to him about, so this was strange. On the other hand, he couldn't think of anything she might want to talk about that would be bad, so he nodded quickly and agreed. Certainly. The two of them walked over to the cold stone bench and sat down. Silence fell again. This didn't bother Naruto at all. He was fine waiting to hear what she had to say. What if she didn't say it? Well, he'd be interested, but as far as he knew, it wasn't a big deal. After almost 5 minutes of silence, she got up her courage and jumped right in. "Hinata no Makoto is known to me." He raised an eyebrow, but that was the only sign he had heard her. Still, Why do you start with that? He knew she was the heiress now, so she should have been trained to be the next head, right? Hiyashi knew how to play the game and was damn good at it. Was she doing this on purpose or was she just terrible at being sneaky? If he had been a weaker man, she would have been dead as soon as she heard the words, and he would have worried about who else might have known and how she found out later. He wasn't a weak man, and he was smart enough to listen to her before deciding what to do. Now, of whom? She gave him a small glare, and the sharp lines on her face made him think of her father. It was clear who she was going after, and it looked like he was in a worse position than he had thought. Hiyashi could think about his ideas in peace, and he would keep playing the game, but at a lower level. If this was the man's plan, Naruto both swore at him and gave him a thumbs up. If not, he was still in a bad position, wasn't he? I know you know. He couldn't stop the small grin that kept pulling at his lips. And now I know you know that I know what, exactly. She gave him a dirty look and scowled, which, given her age and size, was actually more cute than anything else. About Hinata no Makoto. What is it about Hinata no Makoto that I should know that you already know I know? She snarlada really snarled. He was beginning to like it. Before she grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him closer to her. Before she realized that there was a knife to her throat and that he was no longer laughing, their noses were touching. She slowly let go of him, but her eyes never left the cold metal that was touching her skin. I don't think we should try that again now, do we? She almost couldn't help but nod. Why yes. She knew she would, because that almost cost her life when all she wanted to do was give him a dirty look and tell him to stop. Now, what were you saying? He asked as he put his sword back on the purple sash around his waist. She started again. I know what Hinata's doing. It was clear that she would have to be honest and hope that she was right. There wasn't much chance that she was wrong, but even a small chance was enough for something to go wrong. And I know that the wolves are with her. Do you now? That's interesting. He didn't sound the least bit interested, and the way he looked down at her like an angry god made her want to hide. She promised herself that she wouldn't be so stupid as to touch him without permission again. At least, not until they got along at least okay. She had to keep in mind that this wasn't a student at the academy or a lowly clan member. This wasn't even a fair fight. He was better than her. Whether she was trying to rile her up or not, she shouldn't have been so free with her actions. She was the daughter of Hiyashi and the heiress of the Hyuga family. She knew better than to lose control like that, even for a second. I know you have close ties to the wolves, and I'm not so stupid to think that our clan won't fall apart even if my father and the elders win. What's the point of winning? The clan. That was her answer right away. Hinata has a group of branch members who follow her, and either she'll move or my father will find out and do something. Either way, people like me who are part of the main branch will lose. Oh? He asked with a raised eyebrow and a curious look on his face. Why do you think that? Even if the branch members don't kill us all, the clan will fall apart without them. The wolves will help my sister, so it won't have as much an effect on them. Oh, I see. So you're saying you want to help your sister? Her eyes lit up with anger right away. No, she almost spit out. I won't join her because she's bad for our clan, he told the young girl. But there's nothing I can do to stop her. Then why did you want to talk to me? Because I want out. I may not be able to stop our fall, but I won't let my sister kill me. You're with the wolves, and the wolves are on Hinata's side. Well, I guess I could talk to them. That's not what I want, she said. And what are you asking is? She thought for a second, but then she got over her pride and threw herself down in front of him, groveling at his feet. Protection. Her voice was a little hard to hear because of where she was, but he got the message. I want to be safe under your care, Naruto-sama. He blinked a few times as he thought about what she said. That was totally out of the blue. Here he was, ready to hurt her so that Hinata's actions wouldn't get out, and she was willing to give up her pride for the slimmest chance of being saved. He hadn't seen this coming, but he gave a small laugh as a smile spread across his face. He may not have ever thought that this would happen, but he wasn't about to let this chance pass him by. When he got off the bench, he had just enough room to get down on his knees above her. With one hand, he cupped her cheek and turned her face to look at his. He asked, "Do you have any idea what you're asking? Are you really aware of what you're doing?" Why yes, Naruto-sama, I know what I'm asking and what position I'm putting myself in, but I have no other choice. I can't live on my own, and the only way to live with the Hyuga is to hope I'm spared long enough to beg at my sister's feet. I would rather have the choice of pledging myself to someone else than be forced into such a position. He thought it was admirable. In the end, it wasn't very helpful for her, but who was he to complain? With both of the clan head's daughters, the Hyuga were already as good as his. Even if they were already, this only made it more certain. He briefly considered using her to get more Hyuga on his side before things got bad in the clan, but he decided against it. People would start to doubt you, which wasn't good. Hinata's small cult wasn't ready to be found out, and not yet. He would just hide her until everything was over, at which point he could either use her to back up Hinata's rule or put her in charge of the clan as head to do as he pleased. In either case, he would be in charge of the most powerful clan in the most wealthy village. And that was not likely, especially since he was the daimyo of a country far away. When he thought about it, it made him frown. He would have to keep the fact that he and the wolves were involved a secret. He didn't need the daimyo of Hino Kuni to think that he was trying to take over his hidden village right now. The man would be worried if he knew that another daimyo, even one who was on his side, was in charge of a large group of warriors who swore to protect his country. It would look too much like he was trying to use their alliance to claim Hino Kuni as his own, which isn't hard to believe since that's how he became daimyo in the first place. But that was something that could be worked on later. He wasn't going to let this chance go by. And what if he had to leave her in the end to keep his other plans? So be it. Her sister was already his, and through her, the whole clan. No, this was just an extra safety net or chance, and he didn't want to miss out on it now that it was in front of him. He finally said, "Very well. You're going to the academy, right?" "I am." She nodded as much as she could when he put his hand on her chin. "Tomorrow, I'll send someone to get you after work so we can talk more about this. They'll be wearing my sash, so you'll know who they are. Follow them, but don't join them until they tell you to, okay?" "That's fine, Naruto-sama. I'll do what you say." It was clear that saying those words hurt her, but that just made him smile. Hinata may have been hurt by her at some point, but he didn't hold it against her. Already, the fact that what she did made the former heiress even more loyal to him was a point in her favor. There was also something to be said about a proud member of the main branch giving in to him completely. The wolf inside of him was happy. "Come on, stand up. It's time to go back to your father," he said, pushing her up with the hand that was still on her chin. "We gave him enough time to think things over." Yes, Naruto-sama. She was giving up now because she knew she had to rely on him to save her clan. But how long would it be before she could no longer give up? When would her lack of pride cause her whole body to scream in pain and make her act against him? When she could be safe? Sooner. He looked down and saw her standing there with her eyes on the ground, waiting for him to take the lead. This made him laugh. She waited, like a snake ready to strike or a wolf ready to pounce. She was scared now, but only because she had to be. If he was being honest, he was waiting for her to hit him when she could take no more. He couldn't wait at all. Things might have just become a little more interesting in Konoha. Things did not go at all the way he thought they would. It wasn't bad that happened. On the contrary, he ended up having a good time at dinner with his guest. It was not only enlightening, it made sense that he had been able to find allies strong enough to help him defeat one of Konoha's clans from the Shadowsa, but it was also nice to have someone he could look at as an equal. He was the leader of the Hyuga, but the boy just had powerful friends, so it wasn't a matter of status. This game really didn't have enough people in it. Well, not really. There were a lot of Tama, too many, in fact, but only a few of them were any good. He had always thought that was a damn shame, because he liked the game's hidden messages and moves. Promises and threats were both hidden in compliments and pleasantries. There really was no better way to spend time for people like him. And now he really did have a rival, and it was a good one. He was already tempted to move against the young man so that they could get their game going. That was unfortunate because it was a very stupid thing for the Hyuga head to do. No, he would have to do things right and give the game time to make itself. Definitely, it would be a better game if he didn't rush into it right now. He was very tempted to do it anyway, though. The battleground where their words would dance and strike would be smaller, but they would be able to play so much sooner. And that was just one reason why he was secretly thankful for what his daughter had done, and, if she knew, the insight she had given him, he wouldn't be too surprised if she knew what was going on, since even Hinata had stayed in the kitchen until their guest came back with the heiress. If his daughter, who hadn't even reached the age where he would start to teach her how to play, could figure out what was going on around her well enough to act correctly, there was no way Hanabi hadn't done the same. That is, if she hadn't been totally in love with the boy. Hiyashi made a small grimace. He had never dealt with anything like this before, and it had never occurred to him that it could happen. As the head's daughter, he knew his daughters would get married someday, but he had never really thought about either of them having romantic interests. Even less so with the only opponent he had been able to find in Konoha. Hiruzen and Danzo were here, but it was bad form to get between two opponents, especially when they had been playing their game for so long. It was also bad form to go against the cage, and anyone who was connected to Danzo was usually looked down upon by, well, everyone. At least every shinobi and any non-shinobi who didn't mind wouldn't like the old war hawk enough to see him as a good opponent for the Hyuga head. No, neither of them were good enough, but now that he had found someone, his youngest daughter, who was still too young for that kind of thing, seemed to like him a lot. Even he found it hard to take his eyes off the young man, who was, without a doubt, very attractive. Fate had really been kind to him by giving him a rival who could both act and look like the part he was supposed to play. Still, the Hyuga didn't deserve any better, and if Hanabi really liked him, he would be able to accept that. Not only would it make their game more interesting, but Hiyashi didn't have anyone else who could compete with the boy right now. At least for now, he was the best guy she could date. That could change, but if she wanted to have a crush on him now, that was her choice. Either she would get over it by the time he found someone better than her, he would turn out to be the best choice in the end, or she would already be married to someone else. That's how it was for the Hyuga's daughter, and she wouldn't have expected anything else. That meant, of course, that she was willing to take the risk if that's what it was, and if she went ahead, it would be on her own head. Well, he thought that was the case if she was really trying to tell him these things. He had spent the night starting a game for the first time in a long time, and his mind was working hard to figure out what had happened. Still, it was possible that he saw things that weren't there, like subtle signs and messages that only existed because he thought they did. Hanabi and Hinata weren't the players, but they were on the board, so that had to mean something, right? Right? He might have needed to spend his last time in peace and quiet to calm down. But just a little. He couldn't stop being careful around the boy, could he? Even though he knew for sure that his face had been the same throughout the dinner, nearly calm, only slightly interested, and with the smallest of polite smiles, he also knew that his eyes must have been dancing with joy. From the moment he and Hanabi walked back into the dining room, Hiyashi's polite host face had changed just a little bit. Every once in a while, a frown that changed between thoughtful and unhappy would flash across his face for a fraction of a second. Even though he tried to keep his eyes on his guest, he kept looking back and forth between himself and his youngest daughter, as if that would explain the change that had happened while the young man was in the garden. Naruto wasn't worried that the older man thought he and his daughter had done something wrong. After all, they were opponents, and the game had just begun. However, it was clear that he thought something had happened between them. Just what, he couldn't figure out. Naruto was amused, but he didn't show it beyond having mischievously happy eyes. He decided not to tell the man anything. If he wanted to know, he could ask her, better yet, play the game in a way that made it clear. Obviously, if he wanted the game to really start, he couldn't be both suspicious and a nice host the whole night. Hiyashi said, I have to say, Naruto-san, you have surprised me in a good way. I knew you were a great young man because you stood up for my daughter and made the connections you did, but you have far surpassed my expectations. Thank you, Hiyashi-sama, for your kind words. He leaned his upper body forward a little. It's very kind of you to give them to me. Still, his eyes almost sang with victory, and Hiyashi didn't believe for a second that the boy was being fake when he said he was sorry. I have no problem telling you the truth, Naruto-san. You deserve my praise and more, not just for what you did with my daughter, but also for what you've done since then. Surely you know, Hiyashi-sama, that graduating from the academy isn't hard. You went through it yourself at the start of your career, didn't you? His blank face cracked just enough for a small smirk to tug at his lips. It was time to get serious. Of course, of course. The Hyuga head's frown was short and was quickly replaced by a faint smile. But you've been up to a lot more than that, haven't you? Have I? He only slightly tried to look confused. I'm afraid I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm just a simple boy starting out as a shinobi, which is pretty boring for a man in your position. Oh, Naruto-san, don't be so hard on yourself now. The smile was now at its fullest. It was small, but it was easy to see, which is a very rare thing. You went up against an entire clan and came out unscathed. Fada Kunoichi, who had been trained by one of Konoha's best for years, and sometimes went on missions with Tokubetsu Junin Mitarashi Anko. There aren't many people who can say they're on her side, and the fact that a genin knows her personally is already amazing. Hiyashi didn't like the woman very much, But he didn't have anything against her either. She had a job to do, which she did pretty well. She was strange and crazy, but so were most shinobi in Kunoichi. Even though he said he knew her, what was most impressive was that he had lived through her. She was violent and had a bad temper, so either the young man at his table was very good at reading people and acting accordingly, or he was very, very good at dodging and hiding. On the other hand, he might have been good at both. Maybe I'm just lucky, suggested the young daimyo. Maybe, Hiyashi agreed. He didn't like how small it was, but they both started to stretch to get ready. They had already looked at the water, but now they really tried it. They might be able to jump in soon. But not today, sadly. This was as close as they would get to the real game tonight. And that's how it went for the rest of the dinner. He didn't stay there long before he thanked his hosts and went on his way. Only 2 of the 4 were pleased with how things turned out. It was a little scary, because he didn't know what to think for the first time in a very long time. Since he was a Nara, it's easy to see why such an event would seem strange to him. It went against his nature to not be able to just look at something, anything, and figure out what it meant. In this case, though, he had no idea what to do. Moves were being made around Konoha, or at least in the Land of Fire, but why? Who were the players, what was the game, and who would get caught in the middle? He could hear Sume and Inoichi talking loudly enough to understand everything they said. He was smart enough to know that Sume had chosen a side and that Inoichi wanted her help to do the same. He knew, too, that neither of them was a player in the game. Not really, at least. That could be because the real game he was talking about was one that took place all over the world. Yes, they played their own games, but at this point, they couldn't really be called players. Only pieces that have more freedom than others. But if that was the case, who were they teaming up with, or were they, too, not a player but a higher-ranking piece? There wasn't enough information, and he hadn't taken part in a while, either as a piece or as a player. He could join in without much trouble and do very well. Should he, though? Was it worth the prize, whatever it was, to play this game so close to his home? It was still a small game. Things weren't too quiet or too busy for it to be too big yet. However, it would grow until the winner joined as a real player, unless they had already done so. And if the player just happened to be working in Konoha for some reason, did he or she really think they were up to the challenge of starting from the beginning as a clan head? Shikaku didn't like this, not at all. That's a pain. Kato Shizune was in a state that was worse than being completely bored. Or, more accurately, was there. Since a long, long time ago. She had never thought she would miss being dragged around Fire Country and watching one of Konoha's Sannin as a child, but at least she was doing something at the time. That doesn't mean she hasn't done anything in Konoha over the past 4 years, but working part-time at the hospital isn't exactly what she would call exciting. She had been very helpful, but she had also done the same thing when she was traveling. People who didn't have regular access to highly trained medical staff were also much more grateful for what she did for them, especially since she usually couldn't bring herself to charge them for her services. The shinobi and regular people here were just a bunch of spoiled brats. But that wasn't really the issue, was it? No, the problem was that she was so bored that she didn't know what to do. She still didn't have many friends. When she wasn't taking care of her master, she worked in the hospital, but even the few friends she did have didn't do much. People might think that because it was a shinobi village, there was a lot to do there, but all it meant was that there were a lot of bars and you could buy 2 packs of kunai at any convenience store. Shinobi didn't have much to do when they weren't on missions, and not much was done to change that. They had nothing else to do, so it's not surprising that so many of them went crazy. She tried to write, but she didn't like it, and she tried to read, but she was too restless. She even tried to get drunk like her master, but she didn't like that either. Still, she was bored. She thought that there was nothing to do in Konoha. Or, if there was something, it was very good at hiding from her. She wished she knew of a place to gamble in Konoha, not for the first time. At least it gave her something to do, and it showed how much better she was than her master. Even if that wasn't very interesting, she could use the money she won to go shopping. When she thought about money, she remembered the boy she had seen picking pockets all those years ago. They saw each other now and then and, if she's to be believed, got along pretty well, but they weren't really friends. She might be able to find him one day, which would be helpful. He might know where she could go to gamble illegally for an hour or so, and he might also know what people do for fun around here. She might be able to train him if he wasn't too busy with whatever team he was put on, and if it came down to it, she knew how successful he was in his first job. Being a shinobi wasn't too different, it just had more parts. If it came down to it, she might even be able to convince him to lend her money. After all, a shopping spree did sound pretty good right now. There was something wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. As she became a genin, her father started giving her more responsibilities, but he has been giving up on her more and more lately. He also seemed to spend as much time as possible with her and her mother. He used to pay them a lot of attention, but now he was almost too much for them. Something had happened, and this wasn't her father. Or something was coming up. It seemed like he didn't think he would be around for long and was trying to make the most of the time he had left. And that made her nervous. Not just because she would lose her father or her mother's husband, but also because she could only think of one group that would make the man act that way. The wolf's house. So, what did he do? Even though Kushina was higher up in the clan than she was as acting head, it didn't take much work for her to find out that 3 clan members had gone missing. One came back. By the time she went to talk to him about it, he had already left. And so was a big chunk of their small amount of money. Kushina made sure that the clan had what it needed, but it was hard to find anything else. Theft seemed like a simple thing to do, but Yamanaka Ino wasn't going to believe that for a second. The way her father was acting, the fact that 2 shinobi were missing, and the fact that the 3rd had come back only to leave again made her realize that something had happened, or, better yet, that something had failed. The wolves have something against them, she swore to herself. She thought her father, of all people, would know better, but it seems like recent events have gotten to him and started to hurt him. She didn't know what he thought was a good idea or how it went wrong to the point that the only person who knew about it left with enough money to start a new life, but she did know that it would affect her clan in some way. Again, the wolves had their teeth over their throats. And she had no idea why. Nami no Kuni was blessed with cooler sea breezes, while AIM was cursed with hot air from Hai no Kuni. This kept the humidity down and made life in Nami no Kuni more pleasant all around. It also made fun of her by showing her all of AIM's flaws, since that was her next stop. It was almost as if it was trying to get her to stay in the land of the wolves, which she would be happy to do if it didn't mean giving up information about an S-class organization that could one day be a threat to Naruto and the wolves. Still, she was glad for the break before she had to go back to the land of rain. As a kunoichi, it had been easy to get there, but she and Naruto had talked about giving her the carriage to make sure it got back to Nami no Kuni safely. The plan was scrapped because she had to go back to the land of rain and because his trip wasn't over yet, but Makoto wasn't sure if she liked it that way or not. On the one hand, the trip would have taken forever and, from what Naruto had said, was so boring that it would drive anyone crazy. On the other hand, she'd get to be away from AIM for even longer. Had she already said that she didn't like AIM? Wave was much nicer, and her trip here had been very easy so far, even though she didn't like the small country that had been in wars in the past. She had seen wolves 3 times, but they never came near her or got in the way of her journey. She had to wonder when word of her return to their territory got out, because when she met Naruto's carriage a week ago, she hadn't been greeted nearly as warmly in the, "We don't have anything against you, but you're not important enough for us to do anything for you," sense. She didn't want to look a gift horse in the mouth, though, so she just kept going. She was a little surprised by the town itself, since it wouldn't be long before she had to start calling it a city. Other than that, though, nothing else really stood out. Well, except for the scaffolding that stood out above the trees in the distance. She didn't know anything about that, but she didn't know much about Naruto's plans either. Both the fact that she didn't really ask and the fact that it was a bad idea to send such information to a spy could be to blame. The point was to get information from them to give you an edge, but that was pretty much ruined if the information flowed both ways. As had already been said, she hadn't really asked either, of course. She cared much more about Naruto and how he was doing than what he had his wolves do. She knew that the wolves were important, but only because he thought they were important. After all, she had agreed to give him this letter because of this reason. She couldn't help but think, though, that his request was about more than he was saying. Was the reason he asked her to come to Nami no Kuni because she was there and wouldn't be going with him to Konoha? Or did he need her to be there for some other reason? His first thought was that he wanted the wolves to get used to her and how she related to him as their leader. This could also be said as he wanted to introduce her to the wolves. On the other hand, she knew how important these wolves were to Hima. They were almost like his children, so maybe he just wanted to show her the wolves. Both did the same thing, but their meanings were different. Even so, that wasn't really the point. She had to do that because he asked her to. She had a letter to deliver. She could try to figure out why he did what he did later, or she could just ask him in her next letter. He might decide to answer her, if she's lucky. Considering this, it wasn't too hard to find the wolves. Not only could they go in and out of the forest at will, but every person who lived there could point her in the right direction. She probably could have asked the wolves, but she didn't. The mansion of the late Gato was in a rather open clearing. Even though it was fortified, it seemed strange to her that they had made this place their seat of power, even temporarily. Everything about it made her think of a target. Of course, they didn't have a whole lot of other choices, did they? Even now, they were more interested in building up the civilian parts of the town and figuring out how to make it easier for their country to trade by adding more warehouses and docks. Maybe they just didn't have enough money right now, so they focused on things that would bring in more money so they could do what they needed to do. That is, building a place to hide that could keep them safe. Or at least make a house that looks more like it belongs to her Naruto. Even from the outside, this place was nice, but Naruto was now a daimyo, which meant he needed something a little more grand. At least that's what she thought. We all know that her thoughts were the most important when it came to this. She had no trouble getting into the ship, and Tsunami, a woman who reminded her a lot of herself, led her right to the temporary office of Commander Sai. It was a little scary, but she couldn't help but wonder if her behind looked as good as the civilian mom's. It should have, since she was a kunoichi and her body was in the best shape possible. Was it though? Even though she was worried about how her behind looked, the woman was quiet and polite. Even better, she didn't waste any time getting her to where she needed to go. Sometimes she'd say something about the area, like how a certain piece of the late Gato's art was made or where a pair of wolves did something stupid, which apparently happened more often than she'd thought. But soon, the double doors of one of the smaller rooms met them, and Tsunami opened the door without even waiting for a response. Makoto wasn't sure if that was a mistake, if it was the right thing to do, if there was something between the woman and whoever this commander was, if it was because of Tsunami's connection to Naruto, or even if it was because of her. She was sure that Tsunami didn't care one bit that she did it and walked away, leaving her alone to go into the commander's office. Again, she was pretty surprised, even though she really had no reason to be. Sai, the commander, was only 2 years older than Naruto, which is much younger than anyone would expect someone in that position to be. Ah, Mother Crow. She didn't like the name she gave herself on the spot when she went to see Naruto, mostly because it reminded her that she was the mother of the crow, which wasn't what she had meant. Part of the mother. Yes. Itachi's mother. No, but she would deal with it for now if it meant she could do the task Naruto asked her to do. Some of the patrols told me you were coming soon. What can I do to help? When we parted ways, Naruto-kun asked me to deliver a letter, she said. She then gave the letter to the person and put her weight on one hip and crossed her arms. She would wait to go until she knew if it had anything to do with her, but if it didn't, she had to get to aim before she got too used to this place and couldn't get herself to leave. Sai raised one brow and quickly opened it. He scanned the words with a snort and then threw it on his desk. When Makoto looked interested, he told her. He said, he wants me to limit the number of guards I send after him. He says I shouldn't send a single operative with more than 2 full guards, but he'd rather it be even less than that, like just 1 guard. What number would you give him? Sai asked, if I had my way or if the wolves had their way. What does it matter? If I had my way, he'd have 10 full guards, a high captain for every 5 guards, and a full guard for both high captains. She didn't think that was that bad an idea. He would at least be safe. If the wolves had, though, there was, he said. We couldn't call it a guard because he would always be surrounded by his whole army. Even though she liked it even more, she could see how impractical it was. Still, having a whole army watch over her new son, it would have helped to think about it. She said, that seems reasonable. Sai didn't say anything at first, but his lips twitched into a small smile, and she could tell he was laughing by the look in his eyes. Still, after a moment of silence, his voice got louder. Let there never be any doubt, Mother Crow, he told her, that you belong here. It didn't sound at all like a criticism, so she nodded and took it as a compliment. She wasn't sure what kind it was. She might have done better to learn more about her son's strengths and weaknesses. Before she broke the awkward silence, she asked if the letter had any other information. Is there anything else? He cocked his head. Maybe, but why? Anything about me. I want to make sure he didn't put anything for me in there before I go back to AIM. Sai nodded in understanding. Yes, of course, I understand. Depending on how much you want to get back to AIM, this could be good or bad news, but he doesn't mention you in the letter. This could be because he didn't want you to bring it or because you have other things to do, but I can't say for sure. Then I guess I'm done here. Is there somewhere I can get something to eat before I leave? I don't know exactly what your relationship to Tsukiyomi-sama is, but he seems to accept you, he said. Our storerooms and armory are open to you. That didn't answer her question at all. Ah, much better. She did find it strange, though, that he called her son by that name when it was clear she already knew who he was. A safety measure, perhaps, but from what? They were all wolves and she guessed Tsunami, so why would that be a problem? Thank you. Still, he was giving her unrestricted access to their own supplies, so at least she could show some gratitude. Naruto would likely kick the boy's ass if he didn't, but it was still appreciated that he had done so without her threatening him with her son. I'll seek out Tsunami again to guide me there. He gave a nod of confirmation at her intentions and turned back to the papers on his desk. Before he could even resume writing, footsteps sounded down the hall as a young woman in her late teens entered the room without so much as a knock. You really should keep the doors closed, Sai. The head of security's been having fits that we'd willingly leave ourselves with one less barrier for any assailants or spies to get through. The girl hadn't looked up from whatever folders she was holding and instead walked blindly across the room to the commander's desk as if she had done so a million times. Anyway, did you take a look at those folders I sent you? I really need your opinion and, better yet, your approval on O? Having finally looked up, she spotted the guest that had been just about to leave. Ah, I'm sorry. Who's this? It would appear that this was the reason Sai refrained from mentioning Naruto's name. And an Inuzuka? She really needed to sit down and talk with her newest son about all the things he'd been up to lately. Sai pointed to the guest he had just finished talking to and said, "This is Mother Crow. She was just leaving." Hannah asked, "Mother Crow?" Her head tilted, just like a dog's might, showing a mix of curiosity and a little bit of confusion. "Mother Crow," she said, and he nodded to agree. "I think she is a friend of Tsukiyomi-sama." "You think?" she asked with doubt. How does someone suppose something, especially if it has to do with Tsukiyomi-sama, who they both served in some way? Well, I'll admit that I don't know exactly what her relationship with him is, but I do know that she met him on his way back from seeing the daimyo, and that she brought a letter from him here today. He turned to look at the soon-to-leave quest, and his eyes showed that he was interested. This made her speak up. She thought there was no reason not to. Makoto said, "He's my son." They were surprised, Sai more than Hannah. Hannah asked, "Your son?" Sai told Hannah everything he knew about Naruto and the woman who said she was his mother. The only thing he really knew about her was that she wasn't Kushina behind the mask, which wasn't much. "As far as I'm concerned," she said, shifting her weight to one hip and crossing her arms over a chest that her cloak didn't do much to hide. "Ah, so she wasn't really his mother. Well, that makes a lot more sense." Hannah asked, "So, are you really his mother then?" Inuzuka really were blunt people, and even though Hannah could be more subtle, she didn't do it very often because it wasn't in her nature to do so. Still, knowing that didn't make the comment any less rude, and Sai flinched just a little when she heard it. He was pretty direct himself, but Mai was trying to teach him a lot of things, including tact. She would be focusing more on budgeting, where he was worse, but Naruto had already taken care of that. He probably liked it that way, to be honest. At least Naruto was more likely to just go to Mai for a massage if he got too stressed out by the huge task of fixing Sai's money problems. Mai just kept getting madder and madder at him. Even though the question seemed rude, she still answered, "I'm the closest thing in his life to one." Or, the closest thing she knew to it. Yugao, Naruto's sensei, came close to taking her place, and Mai often took care of Naruto like a mother would. She was sometimes too close, but not so much that it couldn't be ignored. But if he stayed in Wave longer, Tsunami could easily take his place. Kurenai could have done the same thing if she didn't want to be seen as the older sister. In fact, Makoto was the closest thing he had to a mother because she was the only one who called herself that, and he didn't see any reason to argue with her since it made her happy and didn't bother him at all. Even so, Makoto didn't know any of that. No, she didn't think anyone else could compare. And that was fine, because what she needed was a stable role where she felt like she was needed. In this case, though, it also helped a lot with any lingering doubts Sai might have had about the person, who was still mostly unknown. It also put her in a good light with the Inuzuka right away, which was good because Makoto was very curious about the girl's presence. "Oh, I see. Well, then, it's good that he has you." Hana couldn't really mean this because she didn't know much about the leader of the wolves other than what she had seen in the short time she had spent with him. Still, if she was the closest thing he had to a mother, that meant he didn't have anyone else in that role before her, right? So, maybe it was a good thing that she was able to fill it for him. Still, who was she to say that she knew anything about that? She didn't know anything about his personal life, if he had one, and there didn't seem to be any hints about his past right away. She was interested, but she knew that if she asked, she wouldn't get an answer. It also seemed rude to both ask about him and admit that she didn't know anything about him. From what she could see, there was no way to win. Sai didn't say anything about it. Instead, he gave a simple nod to show that he agreed and went back to work. He would let them talk, though he would probably only pay a little attention to what they said. He didn't know what he might find out. He wasn't sure, though, whether or not that was a good thing. He'd have to take that risk. Take that chance and hope that it wasn't too bad. If he was lucky, they would start talking about Naruto's best traits in his office, and he would have to work through it. That would be a terrible thing to do. Makoto said, "Someone needs to look out for him." She changed that sentence quickly, before anyone could get upset. Naruto did like his wolves a lot, after all. And while you've been doing a good job of keeping him safe and taking care of him, he needs someone who knows him better. Sai gave a careless nod, never taking his eyes off his desk. He thought pretty much the same thing, but he thought Naruto needed a different kind of relationship that was more personal. He thought that Mai would probably fill that role. But in the end, it didn't matter all that much, and the job still wasn't filled. It was fine for Naruto to have a surrogate mother and get along well with Mai. In fact, that was probably better for everyone because Naruto would have more people to help him and keep him from working himself to death. He didn't do much anymore because he and Mai were in charge of most of it, but Sai didn't think Naruto didn't spend most of his time looking for ways to make things better for the wolves. He cared too much about them not to, and the fact that he didn't have much else to do besides his self-appointed job as wolf father only made things worse. This was something the young man had said before, and Sai agreed with him. Naruto needed a hobby. Sai couldn't think of any because all he did was work, train, and sleep. Almost like Naruto, in fact. He used to paint, but these days he doesn't have much time for that. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad if Naruto took on a little more work. No, he wasn't joking. If the young man with red hair could, he would run the country and the organization all by himself. Giving him more work wouldn't help. So, it might be a good idea to hire more people to work in the office. Sai would need to find out more. But that was for another time, so he went back to his work and paid only a little attention to what was being said next. She said, "Of course," and went on. "There are people in his life that I don't even know about," she said, pointing to Hana to show who she was talking about. "So, even though I play a pretty important part, I can't help but wonder if I'm the only one who knows him well." Raised eyebrows were a clear sign of a question. "Ah, I don't know him that well. We didn't spend much time together before he went to Hai no Kuni." "I see," Makoto said softly as she thought about it. "So you aren't close then? I would think that since you are an Inuzuka, you must be close enough to him to be able to be trusted with any information about what he does." Hana was about to say something, but she stopped herself by giving Makoto a hard look. "How much do you really know about his work? I've never heard of you before, and yet you say you play such a big part in Tsukiyomi-sama's life." She trailed off, her eyes narrowing at the woman in the cloak. "Almost nothing," Makoto said. Since her surrogate son trusted these people, it was best to be as open and honest as she could so she didn't end up driving a wedge between them and her son. The young man needed all the help he could get to make sure he was safe, happy, and healthy. She didn't want to risk any of that just because the girl was suspicious of her. As she should be, the last female Uchiha thought with a wry smile. She was a spy, and the group she was gathering information for was just now getting to know her. Even if she didn't like it, who were they to ask her questions? Only because it was for Naruto's sake did she let them do it. She had to keep telling herself that if she did anything to drive a wedge between them, he would be upset with her, which was about the last thing she wanted after losing him completely. There was nothing worse than that could happen. Even so, it took her a lot of effort to be nice to the people he chose to hang out with. She didn't think they were good enough to get even the smallest amount of his attention. She wasn't going to say anything to them or to him, though. If he wanted them around, that was his choice, even if she didn't think they were good enough. Then again, who, besides herself, was? She had to act nice for Naruto, even if she didn't think he was worth it. Still, she wasn't sure how long she could hold out before she told them what she really thought of them. When she stopped thinking, her voice was clear even though she was wearing a mask. My position is not a good place for information to flow backwards, she said. If information went both ways, it could make my job rather pointless. Hannah didn't need long to figure out what the woman was referring to. It was both a question and an accusation. You're a spy. Makoto gave a lazy shrug and said, maybe, but it didn't really matter. Both Sai and Hannah knew what she did for Naruto, even if she wasn't going to come out and say so. It didn't matter all that much, but it was hard to think you were a spy when you went around freely telling people what you did. Sai mumbled quietly, that would explain the ravens. It made sense, but he couldn't figure out why she'd call herself Mother Crow if she used a different bird. They were similar, but they were still different species. Hannah could hear him very well because she had very good hearing. Because of this, he had to be very careful about what he said so he wouldn't tell her something she wasn't supposed to know yet. Ravens. Makoto said. I train them, and they make good messengers. Then why is it called Mother Crow? She asked the question to a grateful Sai and had not wanted to. Because I made it up on the spot when I went to see Tsukiyomi and it flowed better than Mother Raven. She finished the sentence with a shrug and then said, it's fitting in its own way, but I'd rather not talk about it. I don't really like my name, but Tsukiyomi was able to find me in Hai no Kuni because of it. Oh, I see. It kind of made sense, but she still thought it was strange. Even so, that wasn't the point. The important thing was that Sai had seen this woman and Tsukiyomi talk to each other in person. Saying you were his mother was one thing, but being able to back up your claim by saying you were spying for him helped. Even though that did make me wonder. She asked with a slight tilt of the head, why is his surrogate mother spying for him? He seems to go out of his way to make sure those close to him are safe. I can't tell you that. Not to you, Makoto said before Hannah could say anything. It has too much to do with who I am. Suffice it to say that I had the chance to join an organization that could have been a threat to Tsukiyomi in the future, and I did so to keep him in the loop. Hannah didn't like it, but she could accept it. I guess I can understand that. Sai got up from his desk and asked, how long have you been doing this for him? He only briefly looked up from his work to meet her eyes as he asked. Since before he had you wolves. That was all she said, because she didn't want to risk giving away more information about who she was, but it was enough. With a nod, Sai accepted her answer. It would explain why he had never heard of her before, since Naruto still had a terrible habit of keeping things to himself instead of letting others help him. Mai was still trying to figure out how to fix it. She wasn't making nearly as much progress as anyone would have liked, though. Now, if you're done asking me questions, I'm still curious about the presence of an Inuzuka. I know that your clan members are loyal, which would make Tsukiyomi want to work with them. She really didn't like calling him that. But you look too much like Sum for her not to be your mother. I can't see you being here without the clan being involved. Hannah had to blink twice because she couldn't believe how true that was. It's clear that the woman wasn't a spy for no reason. Even Sai, who was still trying to pay attention to his work enough to do more than just listen to their conversation, raised a brow to show that he was impressed. People didn't have to make a big leap of logic to figure it out, but the fact that few people outside of the wolves knew, and most of those who did were the Inuzuka, stayed. Now there was still another. It was never going to stay a secret for long, or even as long as any of them would have liked. Global operations that Danzo had seen before hinted at the same thing, and now that they were out in the open, it was more likely that someone would find out more than they were ready for the world to know. If they were lucky, though, being out in the open would give anyone who came by a lot to look at and might keep them from noticing some of the more sensitive parts. Like the agreement with the Konoha clan. That was a pretty big one that they would rather put off until the Hyuga were dealt with. One clan at a time was more than enough, thank you. At least, that's what Sai thought. If Naruto thought he could handle that much, which wouldn't really surprise Sai, then he might be able to, but Sai would much rather focus on one task at a time. Even if Naruto didn't think they could do more at the time, he wouldn't tell Anyanya, maybe only those closest to him. After all, it would be bad for morale. No, he'd rather be swamped with work than risk making things worse for them. Instead, he would stand tall and proud, showing his children that there was hope. And if that was true, they might be able to handle both clans at the same time. It was amazing what the wolves would do for Naruto, and the harder they would fight for him, the more confident he became. Even though he was also a wolf, he wasn't the only one. Even though he didn't care. Hannah started her own explanation, which took his mind off of his thoughts, which had already taken it off of his work, which wasn't getting done any faster. He already knew this, so there was no point in listening in, but it was still distracting, and he sighed when he realized he wouldn't be able to get any work done as long as they were in his office. Unfortunately, telling them to leave now would look rude, and Naruto seemed to have a lot of respect for the woman in the cloak. Lovely. Mother knows what I do now. When the wolves reached out to us, we decided to join forces with them. You say that almost as if you had a choice. The voice didn't change, but the words were almost sharp, not quite contempt or pity but more like scornful amusement. It was clear that she wouldn't be able to stay nice for long. Aside from the fact that she thought this might upset Naruto, she didn't care much. In fact, she was very happy to be able to tell the girl exactly how she felt about her and anyone else who thought they were good enough for her son to notice. What if Naruto heard about this? She did her best, didn't she? Sai's eyes moved from his desk, where he had stopped working, to the two women standing close by. He realized she wasn't wrong, and he's sure Hannah knew the same, but hearing it was new. Since the first time the deal was made, it had been an unspoken truth. Not quite. That wasn't right. She said that Mai had told her that the wolves would find someone else, but that the deal she was being offered was too good to pass up. At least, not by any shinobi worth their headband. So, even though there was a small chance of missing out, it was never made to sound like the Inuzuka weren't the ones making the decision. Sai would be the first to say that he didn't care much for the games and plans that were made in the political world. He liked the clear order of a military group much better. Well, make that paramilitary, because regular armies were also political. Now that he thought about it, a lot of paramilitary groups were also very involved in politics in order to stay in business. What were they doing then? The House of Wolves, which they were a part of, was definitely political, but the organization itself was really just a way for Naruto or himself to pick people who would then do their jobs just to please Naruto. Some people thought that was strange, but it was actually very easy to set up. You just did what you were told, and you became part of the group that served Naruto, who did what he could to serve them. Maybe things weren't as easy as they seemed at first, but at least they weren't dealing directly with other groups or inter-organization politics that would take attention away from their group's hard-to-understand goal. He thought about how it was like being a part of a machine, where they were each a single part working as a whole to do Naruto's will, which he guessed was to help them. They didn't care about the other clocks because that was Naruto's job, and since one part couldn't replace another, they didn't even try. It was hard and easy at the same time. The operation had many parts, but it was easy in the sense that it kept going with its job. And he thought that was much better than the politics that Naruto and Mai liked to mess around with. It also meant that he didn't really try to understand how regular people did things. He worked with wolves, a group of people who, for the most part, had similar ideas to him. After all, they had all been trained the same way. Because of this, it was easy for the wolves to work well together, but when they were around people they didn't know, they could get confused. So it was easy to see why Sai felt a little bit bad about not having much experience in either field, since even a little bit of knowledge in this situation would help a lot. As he had said before, he knew that in spoken truth, but he had never put it into words like that. Now that he had, he wondered what the heiress of the Inuzuka would think about it. Would the fact that they were forced to do this make them mad in some way? Would it make them angry enough to start to drift apart or, worse, stand against each other? They wouldn't last, but the wolves would still lose, and Sai didn't want to accept that. They were great allies and fit in well with their own pack. It would be a shame to lose them, and Naruto would be upset that he'd have to start looking for new ones. Since they had already made a lot of progress with the Dog Clan, this would be a big setback, especially since they would have to change everything to avoid any damage the Inuzuka could do now that they knew how their operations worked. Even though it wasn't a lot, it was enough to make things hard. If at all possible, they would like to avoid that, thank you. Hannah looked at the woman on the other side of the table and blinked. Once. Twice. As she thought about the words, her eyes narrowed and she let out a small growl. Sai thought about who he was supposed to back if the two of them got into a fight. One said he was both his boss's mother and a spy for another group, while the other was given control over the civilian affairs of a whole country by the same man. Yes, he liked them both, but did he like one more than the other? He thought it might be best to just separate them, but he knew he would have to call for help if he wanted to stop them from ripping each other's throats out. He couldn't understand what was going on, which was very strange. They'd go from being friendly to this as if it were normal, and maybe it was. He thought it might be something about people or just about women, but he didn't know what it was. If nothing else, you could say that Naruto hung out with a bunch of interesting people. Hannah said, "Of course we had a choice. We didn't even need this. We took Tsukiyomi-sama up on his offer because we wanted to, not because we had to. But I still say you didn't have a choice. Soon, there will be two sides in this world. Those who are with him and those who are against him. You may not have realized it at the time, but that threat has been hanging over your head since he came to power. Luckily, you seem to have made the right choice." Now, that didn't sound right at all. As far as he knew, Naruto wasn't planning to take over the whole world. That would make him an easy target and cost the lives of far too many wolves. How well did this woman really know Naruto? He had to wonder. Still, how well did he do? Could it be that she knew him even better than he did? He felt uneasy just thinking about it, but he couldn't quite figure out why. "We joined Tsukiyomi-sama because we saw the benefits, not because we were afraid of some threat that never existed and never will. Because you made the right choice. Because if we had been threatened, we wouldn't have joined. We are with him of our own free will, and we chose to take him up on his offer because we thought it was good. Don't even try to say that we joined him for the wrong reasons, I won't listen." So, Mother Crow seemed almost amused now, which made Sai wonder what was going on. "Damn right, that's true. The more you try to say otherwise, the more you're saying he may have made a bad choice. Neither I nor the other Inuzuka will stand for that, and while I can't speak for the wolves, I'm sure they would stand with us against your words." Makoto stopped, and her whole body tensed up. Her voice, which had been just a little bit amused by the Inuzuka heiress's taunts, disappeared completely. She almost hissed, "Watch out. I'm questioning you, not Tsukiyomi-sama. And he chose for me to be there. You question his judgment when you say things that aren't true. The Inuzuka joined his pack voluntarily, and we will stand by that decision no matter what you say. You even don't know his name." "I don't need to," Hannah declared. "We'll call him by whatever name he wants, and if he wants to tell me his name one day, that's fine, too. Until then, he's Tsukiyomi-sama, father of the wolves, and leader of this great pack." For sure, this pack of Inuzuka and Wolf was great. It was something they had never thought was possible. Even during the clan wars, the Inuzuka were always small and easy to move around. With the addition of the wolves, the combined clan was easily 3 times as big. And they got bigger. Not to mention that their territory crossed borders and that the leader of this pack was allowed to sit on the Imperial Fire Court. One had to agree that the Inuzuka could not have done something like that on their own. Makoto thought for a second and then gave a shallow nod. She agreed. "Very well. You had a choice, and you made the right one. Just remember that once you've made this decision, you can't change it. I expect you to give your all for him. I don't need you to tell me what I and the Inuzuka pack were already planning to do. My mother rules the clan, but even she has accepted him as the current alpha of the combined pack. We will serve him as if he were of Inuzuka blood." Makoto said as she turned to leave, "I don't want you to serve him as if he were a member of your clan. I want you to serve him as if he were your whole world, your reason for living. He should be the cause of every breath you take." She stopped as she got close to the door and peered over her mask at the young Inuzuka woman. "I want you to treat him as if he were your god," she said. "He is Tsukiyomi no Makoto," Hannah proclaimed. "No one would dare say anything other than that I am Lord of Wolves and God of the Moon." "Good." Before Makoto could leave, Hannah said one more thing that made her stop in her tracks. "Have a good trip, Ba-chan." "What?" was a mix of a hiss and an angry cry. Hannah just shrugged. "You're Tsukiyomi's mother, right? If he's our father, that makes you our grandmother. Try not to frown so much, you don't need any more wrinkles. Makoto clenched her fists and bit her tongue just before she stormed off. In fact, it was a pretty impressive show of control. Sai and Hana exchanged a look as she left to find Tsunami and ask him to show her the wolves' supply room so they could leave as soon as possible. Something wasn't right about that woman. It could have been the stress of her job as a spy, or it could have just been her. Either way, she didn't seem like a normal person, not with the way she seemed to switch between being friendly and being mean. But then, they weren't exactly normal, either, were they? A young man was in charge of armies for a lord who was even younger, and the heiress of the Konoha clan was the public face of the only settlement in what had almost always been one of the richest countries in the world. And if you peered out one of the office windows just right, you could see the scaffolding that was part of the outpost that another hidden village was building. The hidden village in sound. Orochi fucking Maru is the name of the village. No, they were not the most normal people, and because of that, they were a pretty strange group, but that woman seemed more strange than the rest. We already said that Orochimaru was working with their godson to help strengthen a country. Is it so strange that the woman who thought she was the boy's mother had more problems than the others? More and more, the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. In the end, he just gave a shrug and went back to work. Naruto was always surrounded by strange people, and that was a good enough reason for him. Hana, on the other hand, was having a harder time understanding it, but that was okay. In the end, Inuzuka Hana was a lot more ordinary than Sai. Even so, such a statement doesn't really say much. One might have to admit that he was a pretty normal wolf, but the wolves themselves, who had been changed by training and conditioning, were only normal enough for the public to think they were strange. Not strange enough to be suspicious, but at least odd. As sleeper agents, they lived among the people of Konoha, but that didn't really help them blend in. It was a miracle that they didn't get caught, to be honest. So, saying that Sai was an average wolf meant that he was pretty weird, and saying that Hana was more normal than him didn't really mean anything. She liked to think of herself as a pretty normal person, but she had just joined a growing group that had just taken over a country and made their leader a daimyo who was welcomed into the Imperial Fire Court, and she hadn't even thought about that choice for a day. Maybe she wasn't as normal as she thought she was. Well, too bad. At least the wolves made things interesting. Surely that was worth something, right? When Tsume needed to tell Mai about her meeting with Inoichi, she went straight to a girl she was getting along with. She hadn't thought for even a second that the young woman might not be alone. Well, that wasn't entirely true. A guard of wolves was to be expected of, but she hadn't thought the busy young woman might be sitting at a table eating with someone else. Plus, she hadn't thought that person would be Tsukiyomi, who is at the top of the food chain. She had no idea that she might be asked to join them. She was very surprised, which is understandable. When she told one of the wolves who was near the Inuzuka clan compound that she needed to talk to Mai right away because anyone who knew about their alliance had to tell the voice of the Muna and was led to a small apartment building near the market, she thought that the young woman she had been spending so much time with lately lived there. She was totally wrong. Since a wolf had come in before her, the mysterious Tsukiyomi knew to hide his face from her sharp eyes. As she walked into the kitchen, guards took positions around the room so they could be seen. And, for the first time ever, she saw the man she had almost completely put the future of her clan in. She wasn't sure what to think of him, to be honest. He wasn't very tall. He wasn't much taller than her own son, though her son was a little taller than most of his peers, with only the Aburame heir and the last Uchiha being taller, and his body was thin in a way that didn't show much strength. At the same time, he walked, talked, and even sat like a man with a lot of power. Maybe that was what confused her the most. Just by looking at him, she could tell he wasn't very strong, at least physically. However, she knew he had a lot of political power. It was power, but it was different from what she was used to. At least not right away. Even if he didn't have a lot of strength himself, he still had a lot of power. That was undeniable. So, she was very careful to be polite in their presence and in their home, which was hard for her to understand. The man lived in an apartment in the Mart district that wasn't too expensive. Really? Of Wave's daimyo, she took a seat at his table and gladly ate the food that one of the wolves put in front of her. The daimyo seemed to look at her for a few minutes, tilting his head just so. She couldn't help but wonder if the young man, who couldn't have been more than 20 years old based on his size, had ever seen her before, even though he had chosen them to work with. Or maybe he didn't know what to think about her almost sudden arrival. That thought made her realize that this was their first time meeting, and even though he had chosen her clan, what she did today would be what he remembers most about her. And hopefully in a good way. So, Soom, I'm glad to see you, but why are you here tonight? Mai's voice was polite as usual, but it didn't have the warmth Soom was used to hearing. It made sense, since now was more of a business call than a social one, but the woman who had spent most of her free time with her felt bad about it. Soom took a quick look at the leader of the wolves, who stayed quiet and sat in his seat with a royal air of ease. Voice of the moon, it seems, is right. She noticed offhand that only Mai ate from her plate, taking small bites between drinks. Even though she didn't want to be rude, she was hesitant to just sit down and share the meal she had interrupted. This was mostly because interrupting the meal was rude, and Tsukiyomi couldn't continue eating with her there because he would have to show his face. What a great way to start out. There was something I needed to tell you, Mai. Oh. One brow rose in surprise, and even Tsukiyomi seemed to lean a little closer to the table, showing that he, too, was interested in what the matriarch of his chosen clan had to say. It's about Inoichi. But before she could finish, Mai gave her lord a look, and he stopped sitting loosely and sat straight up in his seat. Soom could feel that his hidden eyes burned into her as his voice, which was soft but authoritative, almost hissed out his words. You have my full attention, Inuzuka Soom, he said, and she didn't doubt for a second that he meant it. Continue. She thought she didn't need permission, but she did what he said anyway. Recently, he came up to me and said he knew I was with the wolves and wanted to join. Tsukiyomi was still and quiet for a moment as Mai looked at him with worry in her eyes. Then, all at once, he seemed to completely calm down. Soom could feel the smile behind his scarf, and she was sure that his eyes would have been laughing if they hadn't been hidden by his hood. She didn't know what, though, and that made her feel uneasy. What was funny about any of this? He knew, didn't he? She wasn't sure if that was a question, but she answered anyway. Yes, he did. I don't know how he found out, but he came right up to me and asked me about it. As a member of the Yamanaka clan, he could only make empty promises, but I thought you two would want to know anyway. Hey, you've got good instincts then, he said, and she could hear the grin in his voice. It wasn't a good one. This is just what I was looking for. Soom knew that the wolves and the Yamanaka had had problems in the past, but hadn't they already worked out their differences? If that was true, then why did Tsukiyomi seem so happy when she heard about what Inoichi had done? She didn't know what. She found out right away what had caused such a strong reaction. Mai, he said. His voice had a hint of danger to it, like a soft growl in the night. I do think Soom has found out where those spies are coming from. She knew then, at least a little bit, what was going on. From what she knew, she thought it wouldn't be good for the Yamanaka head. She felt a chill go down her back. She was so glad she hadn't agreed to anything permanent with the man. She gave him wary looks because she didn't know how he would react to the fact that she was almost certainly the one who killed his children. Even though it wasn't a sure thing, Naruto could act on it because it was close enough to a sure thing. What she wasn't sure about was what he would do next. Her dark eyes followed him as he leaned back in his chair and looked more relaxed than she had seen him since she told him what had happened. She was glad to hear that, but not so much when she thought about what he might do next. Still, her lord seemed to be in a good mood for the rest of the dinner, during which she and Soom finished their food while Naruto watched. Well, he was high in the sense that his bad feelings now had something to focus on, and he liked the idea of making other people feel bad. Everything changed when Soom went back to her own home. In the middle of the night, when it was dark, they howled because they were hungry for blood. Shadowy figures moving through the world like the breath of gods who have been forgotten. The pack and their herald, a smaller figure that jumped over rooftops and through alleyways like an acrobat at a midnight carnival, did not wake up the village hidden in the leaves. He was their king and god, and now, he would make sure they ate tonight. Wolves flew behind him and jumped long distances to stay close to their leader. He didn't even notice because he was so focused on the task at hand. This wasn't just a message, and it wasn't even about getting even. And he just couldn't wait. Even though his pack almost drooled at the thought of spilling blood in his name, he himself felt his mouth water at the thought of taking his enemy's flesh as payment for his lost children. The hunt had started. They had not tried to be sneaky. With the sound of a broken window, Tsukiyomi led the charge, and his wolves were right behind him. As they moved around him, they came up behind him and pinned him to the wooden floors of his bedroom before the rest of their friends had finished sneaking in the window. Two wolves rushed to guard the door as a third slipped through it, just in time to push Inoichi's wife out of the bedroom before the door shut. After locking the door, they had a moment, but nothing more. Even now, he could hear the man's wife screaming, and Yamanaka clan members would be there soon to find out what was going on. If they were smart, they would see that the wolves were at the top of the food chain and stay away from them. Tsukiyomi didn't think that would happen very often. In fact, he didn't think that would happen. He was sure that these people, who had thought it was a good idea to stand up to him before, would all try to do the same thing again right away. Maybe it was stupid, but it was very human. He was smart enough to get that. As his purple eyes moved from the guarded door to their captive, he gave a wicked grin. He had a feeling, or a suspicion, that it was true, but now he knew it was true as much as he could. It was a shame that Yamanaka Inoichi was the one who had to be held down spread eagle on the floor. He had liked the man, and he still did. What he was about to do was a terrible waste. He knew why the man did what he did, he knew that things had happened that were out of his control, and he agreed with what the man did. The fact that it went against him and caused him to lose his children made him realize he had done something wrong. Even if the way they thought and acted was admirable, what they did was wrong. No matter what, Inoichi would have to pay. Chains that were darker than men's hearts slithered across the floor without anyone thinking about it. They rubbed roughly against the hardwood as they rattled toward the person they were tied to. Once he had Inoichi in his grip, the wolves moved back on their own. Inoichi! 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 Tsukiyomi shook his head in disappointment as he walked toward the bound man. I applaud your efforts, really I do. You almost got yourself out of the mess you got yourself into, but you should have known better than to try to hide this from me. He looked at the man in a strange way, but no one knew what he was really looking at because his face was still covered by his usual scarf and hood. Still, he turned his head just enough to show that something had changed. No one knew for sure what it was, but curiosity didn't seem too far away. I warned you, but I didn't know it was really you. It was still a chance for you to come cleaner. At the very least, run far, far away. The man stopped trying to break free from the chains because he knew it was pointless. Still, he didn't look up at his captors with fear, but with quiet determination. He knew he would die today because of his mistakes, but there was one more thing he had to do first. He had to work very hard to ignore his wife's panicked yelling outside the door. Yes, I should have, but that would have shown that the Yamanaka were responsible, and I couldn't do that to the clan. Naruto gave two nods to show that he understood, but he quickly went back to shaking his head. It could have shown that it was you, Inoichi. Even if she cared about the safety of the clan, your daughter would be more concerned with staying out of our way, and you would have turned over to me any clan members acting on their own to protect your family. He stopped moving for a moment to look at his prey in silence. I know it was you and only you. Before, your clan told your heiress what to do, and she did it, but this time it was a conscious choice made by one man, and it wasn't a good one, as you can see. Inoichi also said, no, it wasn't, but it's over now. You're right, Inoichi. Are you ready to pay the price for what you've done? Inoichi's eyes quickly moved to the door, where he could still hear his hysterical wife crying. He turned back to Tsukiyomi no. He turned back to Naruto with a sigh and asked what had sealed his fate. What made you figure out it was me? You went up to Sume too soon, Naruto told him. That told him everything he needed to know, but Naruto kept going. Had you waited longer, it wouldn't have been so strange to find out about her connection now that the wolves are more open, but to find out so soon. To find out just as a spy with a Yamanaka gets away from our jaws. He gave a light tisk to show his disappointment. You were so close, Inoichi, so close, but now you force my hand. Very well, he said, then closed his eyes and waited for the end. From what Naruto said, he was the only one who needed to be punished for his actions, and that was fine with him. As long as his family was safe, he was willing to live with the results of his bad choices. He didn't see Naruto give a nod to his wolves or see one of them take a tool out of a bag they had brought. But when he heard the loud sound of metal biting into wood, he knew. Even as he clenched his teeth to stop the scream that was trying to get out of his throat, the wolves moved away from his severed arms, not wasting any of the precious little time they had. Inoichi opened his eyes just in time to see the two-hand axes hit him in the kneecaps at the same time. It wasn't a pretty cut. As the metal hit his bone, it tore the skin around the joint. They cut off his arms at the shoulder, but they left the tops of his legs. He couldn't figure out why they did that. He wasn't even going to try to do it. He only had a vague idea that 4 wolves, 2 of whom had just been using those axes, were bandaging his wounds and cauterizing them just enough to keep him from bleeding to death. What he was very aware of, though, was Tsukiyomi coming up behind him. He watched as Tsukiyomi quietly took a blade from a wolf without taking his eyes off the limbless man in front of him. Even though it hurt, he was curious about how strange the blade was. Beyond the sharp curve that shinobi rarely use, there was something strange about it. It took him a moment to realize that the blade was glowing red hot, most likely because of a weak Kaiden jutsu. He also had time to think about how strange it was that they were taking care of his wounds while their leader was getting ready for the final blow. He was in so much pain that it seemed like a lot of work for nothing. Unless, of course, the whole point was to hurt. It took him a few seconds to realize that the knife wasn't meant to kill him, but neither was it something he could ever tell anyone else about. Because that knife was meant to cut off his tongue. With a few quick moves, the muscle in his mouth was gone, and Naruto took a curious look at his prize before turning his attention back to the shinobi, who was now unable to walk. "I told you, Inoichi, that you would be eaten," he said and started to walk away as his wolves wrapped the severed limbs in cloth and put them in the duffel bag that held the axes that had been used to cut them off. "But we don't have to wait until you're dead to do that. I've taken your legs to show you how silly it is to try to run, your arms so you can't move, and your tongue so you can't talk." As he spoke, he kept walking toward the window through which he had come, not paying any attention to the man. You might not have even heard him. I'm sure there are ways to get around this, but I hope you've learned today that it would be stupid to try. Now, he turned around to talk to the man one last time before bed. "Live, Inoichi, so that your clan will always remember what it costs to be stupid. Don't let them cross me again." Then, with his wolves following him, he ran off into the night. There was a big meal to make. She had already been surprised when she walked into the situation, but then she was asked to join them. She could tell right away that Tsukiyomi was in a great mood. Still, he seemed a little bit unhappy. No, a little bit disappointed, but for the most part, he gave off a sense of victory that she couldn't help but think was related to the information she had told him the day before. Maybe that's why they asked her to come with them. She couldn't help but notice that there were a lot more wolves around them than before. If she wasn't wrong, this was at least a full guard, which meant that almost every wolf in Konoha was there. Dinner was served and eaten in almost complete silence, with the wolves standing around the room in relaxed attention. Tsukiyomi didn't stand up and ask for a last drink for the group until after everyone had finished eating. Unlike at the meal, everyone in the room had a glass of wine, and if the bottle was any indication, it was a very good vintage. As Tsukiyomi's toast words kept playing in her head, things got even stranger. Even so, she brought the glass to her lips and took a big drink before the words could really sink in. "To drink the blood of our enemies, those who would kill my children and the wolves' siblings." Much to her own unease, she couldn't get rid of the feeling that he really meant that. When she looked down at her half-full glass, she got a chill. He didn't do it, did he? Yamanaka Inoichi's fate wouldn't be known to the people of Konoha for a week, but as soon as Sume heard it, she was sure of one thing. He had. At first, she was surprised that everyone seemed so lively, but it didn't take her long to figure out why. The spy who killed their relatives and hurt 2 of their own people was found. The spy himself wasn't found, but the person he worked for was. Even worse, the wolves had him in their hands. It was said that his limbs had been cut off and that Tsukiyomi had cut his tongue out of his mouth. This was the same tongue that had told the spies what to do. They left the man alive as a reminder of what would happen if someone crossed them, but he was definitely defeated. He was just another enemy of the wolves who had been defeated. I hope this will be the last time. She also thought that the wolves wouldn't mind crushing them again if that's what it took to show that they weren't to be messed with. At some point, not only their current enemies but also the rest of the world would understand. Still, now wasn't the time to think about that. Now was the time to be happy that the wolf who stole from the pack was punished for being stupid. Soon, she found out that there was even more reason to celebrate. Tsukiyomi, in a cruel act that appealed to the animalistic nature of his pack, had sent them the blood and flesh of the attacker to eat tonight. Before his identity was found out, he told the man what would happen to him. "We will eat you up." And now, from what she knew, the wolves were about to do exactly that. Almost all of the wolves who were stationed here in Nami no Kuni, which was most of the wolves in the pack, came together to eat. She was the only person there who wasn't a wolf. She was sitting between Sai and Waito, who was the only one who had lived through what had led to this. High Captain Kago, who was with the guards when they caught the spies and got a face full of explosive note for it, was sitting next to him and still had bandages on his face. Yakushi Kabuto sat on the other side of Sai, and one of the sound group's leaders sat next to him. The wolves were sitting in front of them, and you could almost feel the excitement in the air. Blood mixed into a broth made with boiled marrow and a little bit of fat was chosen as the way they would eat their enemy. Even though it wasn't the enemy's meat, the stew was mostly made of meat, and only a few potatoes and carrots gave it enough variety to be called something other than meat soup. Of course, that was for all the people who were celebrating. Hannah and the others at the head table got a smaller cup of soup and a plate of grilled meat. Not much thought was needed to figure out what that meat was. Sai and his fellow wolves didn't care about the generally accepted morals of society, so they didn't waste any time getting started. They probably thought it was a great honor that their lord let them do this when everyone else had to eat the stew the kitchens had made. Kabuto and the other sound shinobi ate the stew as part of the party, but they politely refused the plates that were offered to them. Hannah was left at a fork in the road. Did she turn down the human flesh for no reason, like Sound did? Or, like the wolves, did she eat it? She knew it was wrong, but what did morals have to do with the pack she was now a part of? Also, nobody needed to know, did they? She didn't know that when she took her first bite, everyone was watching, and when she took her second bite, she solidified her place among them. If not by name, Inuzuka Hannah was definitely a wolf at heart. She didn't pay attention to the other person in the dark room, who was looking at her with interest. Instead, she looked at the small vial that had been in her last letter. The most interesting thing was that he was sending her a letter that wasn't a reply to one she had sent. Instead, he was sending it to talk to her. Even though it was only a paragraph, it said a lot. A second voice from the same source asked, "Toby, Makoto, what were you sent to do? Who sent it, and who do you talk to?" The second voice asked in a deeper, more suspicious tone. The fact that they came from the same being seemed strange at the time. Could they really be both interested and suspicious at the same time? She answered without thinking, "It's from a friend." She held the small glass vial up to the light so she could see what was inside. As she thought about what she was holding, a light red glow splashed over her face, almost making it glow against her pale skin. "A friend?" asked the deeper voice, which was rough and serious. The other said, "You don't have any friends." One could almost hear the frown on their face. She said, "I do, one, and he wrote this letter to me." "And what does it say?" asked the one with the lighter voice. The other person was sure to want to know. Even though it was dark, you could hear a small smile in her voice when she said, "Not much." She was being vague on purpose to irritate them, and it were Kita it was easy to see that she liked the fact that it did. Just a quick explanation of the gift. When he asked, "And the gift?" it was clear that the darker half was getting tired of her vague answers. Even though she was still smiling, her voice had a wicked edge to it. "The blood of an enemy." She didn't take her eyes off the vial as the letter caught fire. It was an old trick from her clan, but because it was so simple, not many people knew it before the massacre. No one had bothered to learn something that looked so easy when there were more impressive jutsu to learn and, in many cases, steal. Still, she could use it now to get rid of the letter that had her watcher so worried. It wouldn't have hurt her to let him read it, and it might have even been good for her, But her son had written it just for her, and she didn't want to share it with anyone else. She took off the lid with her teeth and drank the contents quickly, just as she had been told to do. If the person in her room had been anyone else, they might have thought what she did was a little strange. But since this person often ate people, it wasn't strange. It seemed even more right when it realized that the symbolism was about eating one's enemy. The person with two voices gave a shrug and left the woman's room. He didn't know who her friend was or who she had defeated, but as long as she didn't mess up the plans her master had given her before he died, he didn't really care what she did. So long as the other people thought she was who he said she was, she could do just about anything she wanted. Pain thought she was the powerful apprentice, while Voice of Madara and the others thought she was somewhere between childish and crazy. Something like this probably wouldn't change either of those points of view, and that was fine with him. She could go ahead and drink the blood of her enemies if she wanted to. He just hoped that she would give him some the next time they met. When she found a vial of blood, it took Orochimaru a lot less time than other people. The note was simple and told her only that the blood she was holding was from an enemy who had been punished for what he had done against the wolves. They had been punished, and her godson was kind enough to send her some of them. She took the blood from the vial and put it in her mouth in one quick move. She took a moment to enjoy the taste of Victoria, not her own, but that of her sweet godson. He was such a good boy. He took care of himself, his troops, and even his enemies. He also made sure to send her gifts. When it came to gifts, she still owed him a lot of them. She would have to spend a lot more time looking for something for the young man who reminded her so much of herself at that age. It was absolutely lovely. Swallowing the blood and grinning as she felt it slide down to settle in her stomach, she turned back to the envelope she had withdrawn the vial from. Chucking it away, she was only idly aware of it shattering against one of the stone walls of her hideout, more focused on neatly folding up the letter to be stored with all the others. Even if it was nothing but a quick description of her gift, it was still written for her by Naruto, and that made it precious. She would make sure to treat it as such. But first, perhaps, a quick retirement to her chambers. That boy had the most wonderful effect on her.
I will continue the story in next part. Till then, we weeb offline.